Everyone assumes that capitalism means companies would be left alone more. The free market means the government stops meddling in the economy and companies are free to do what they want. It's called laissez-faire capitalism, meaning leave it alone. I have formed a different opinion. I think that capitalism means policing the companies more than we currently do today. A minarchist government should regulate companies and control what they do more. An anarcho-capitalist society would have private police forces that control the companies more than today's government. Our government does control companies a lot in the wrong ways that they should stop, so they would do less policing of some types. However, more or less all of the large companies are currently committing large amounts of fraud, and the basic one rule of minarchy or libertarianism or whatever is do not initiate force, which includes fraud. You cannot defraud the public, you cannot break your contracts, you cannot false advertise. So if companies are doing a bunch of that, we need more policing, not less. Capitalism would protect us from these companies better. These companies are routinely and frequently violating our rights, so we need better, more effective policing. Libertarianism on this view has quite a bit in common with Occupy Wall Street or anti-capitalist thinking. There are all these people complaining about the companies and how awful they are, and then you hear all these libertarians who just defend the companies and say, oh, you hate business, the real problem is government. To libertarians in general, government is the out-group, the bad guys, and companies are the in-group, the good guys, and they just take the company's sides, instead of recognizing how much fraud companies are doing. Minarchy is a system of government where the government is minimal. It does the fewest things that make sense. Basically, police, courts, military. It just does law and order. It just does defense. It protects rights, it enforces contracts. But that's it. Why? Why is that a good system? What makes sense about it? The idea is the government has a bunch of guns. They have armed men. They use violence. This is very dangerous. So the group that deals with violence should be minimal in size. They shouldn't do extra stuff. You don't want the people with guns to also grow your food or also build your phones. It's totally unnecessary for the people who grow food or build phones to have a bunch of guns and be involved with violence. So it's better to separate as much stuff as we can away from violence. This will reduce the abuse of violence, the misuse of guns for other incorrect purposes. So, a minimal government is a way of reducing violence and having a more peaceful society. However, it does not mean a tiny government. It means a government that sticks to its job, a limited government. That is something Ayn Rand has actually emphasized, that the goal is not small government per se, it is limited government where the government is limited to its proper functions. A limited government can potentially have a large military. Maybe there is a different country that is dangerous and aggressive and has a large military, so for defensive purposes you need a large military too. So then the minimal government, the minarchy, would have a large military. It'd be a pretty large government with a lot of money and a lot of people working for it and so on. And that is compatible with the idea of minimal government because it's sticking to its minimal role. It's not doing extra stuff like building roads. The government doesn't need to do healthcare, schools, city planning, firefighting, or deal with banking beyond its general role of policing fraud and violence and breaking contracts and so on. So in lots of ways, a minarchy would be a smaller government because there's a bunch of stuff the government does today that it shouldn't be doing. However, I think the experience of large companies in basically every industry would be a more aggressive government that is bossing them around more and controlling them more and telling them you can't do that about more things. Because currently there is widespread fraud that is inadequately policed. This view is it's very well known and uncontroversial in some ways. Not fully uncontroversial, like I'm sure you could find some libertarian to deny it, but some of it is believed by most people. It's considered like the reasonable mainstream view. So like if you just Google for companies doing fraud, you can find lists of things. I searched the other day for healthcare stuff and I found a list of like a dozen fraud cases against healthcare companies in 1 month. And just briefly reviewing them, they looked really quite damning and bad. Like these companies are doing ongoing fraud. One of them, I think it was Kaiser, had done like over $1 billion of billing fraud by miscategorizing what they were billing or billing for services they didn't do or that kind of thing. Allegedly. You could say these lawsuits are all fake and the companies are innocent and blah, 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 but I really doubt it most of the time. Certainly sometimes they're innocent. And if you go ask, like the people in the FTC who regulate the banks and the financial stock trader type people, if you ask them, like, is there a bunch of fraud that they don't police, they're going to say definitely yes. That they don't have the resources to police everything that they would like to. It is widely believed that companies get away with lots of bad behavior, and it gets in the news. And a lot of the facts are basically uncontroversial. Like, Wells Fargo had this big problem where its employees created millions of fake accounts for people. Like, without a person's consent, they opened an account in that person's name. They just signed people up for services and stuff that the person did not want, agree to, or sign up for. That happened. There's not a debate about whether that happened. It was a huge scandal. And there's always some huge scandal in the news about what some company has done really, really badly. What happened with Wells Fargo seems to be basically they set up bad incentive structures, and their company culture, like most, is such that if you give people the wrong incentives, where doing a bunch of fraud will make them money, you can actually get lots and lots of low-level employees to do a bunch of fraud without specifically telling them to. And in fact, while specifically telling them not to, but they'll do it anyways. It doesn't take that much work to get many, many workers working for you to do lots and lots of fraud. You don't have to ask them to do it. You don't have to convince them to do it over their moral objections. You just have to set up incentives. They had a quota system where you were supposed to, get certain amounts of stuff. People signed up for certain amounts of accounts and financial products and stuff. And what happens with those is some people do a bunch of fraud, and then the corporate looks at the numbers and is like, well, this other branch got this many signups and you only have a quarter as many. What are you guys doing? And they pressure all the lower performers to be higher performers. And then the result is lots and lots of fraud across most of their branches, or all. Most people in our society will not resist that kind of pressure. They won't quit their job over it. They won't refuse to participate and lose out on raises, bonuses, promotions, etc. They'll just go along with it if everyone else is, if the people above them are pushing it, if they feel that they don't really have a choice, and that they need a job, and also that there aren't a bunch of better jobs elsewhere. Yes, they could quit at Wells Fargo and go work at Bank of America or McDonald's or Starbucks or in an Amazon warehouse or work for UPS, but none of those jobs are better. Maybe they don't involve you personally committing a bunch of fraud. So there are some advantages. However, those are all shitty jobs that have a lot of problems where your employer is a total jerk and exploits and abuses you. And you have a bad time. It's not like you get a good job working for a reasonable person doing productive work that is appreciated, where you can get ahead by doing a good job and being smart and rational and honest. They're not jobs like that. They're some mix of dead-end jobs and jobs where your employer puts unreasonable demands on you. They expect you to deliver too many packages per hour, and then they also tell you don't speed, follow all road regulations, except that you can't deliver all your packages on time if you do that. And so you get a bunch of drivers who speed, and company policy says don't speed, but the incentives, the pressure, get a lot of them to speed. So that's shitty because they don't want to speed, they don't want to break the law, they don't want to be a safety risk. And so essentially, Amazon and UPS are killing people in car accidents with these incentives. They're increasing the rate of car accidents. And people are dying. And they're not getting in trouble for that. They're getting away with it. They're causing these deaths so that they can make more money. and they're not paying for the downside. Their policies have a downside, but the costs are imposed on other people. They blame the individual drivers and fire them, and they're not getting sued a bunch effectively. But they should be. It is on them to figure out reasonable policies that actually work, so that their delivery people can drive around safely. And I think UPS's position is probably that if they started doing that, then FedEx would have lower prices than them. FedEx's drivers would drive too fast, and their drivers would drive slow, and they would have to hire more people, and they would lose market share. They don't want to reform unless their competitors reform, or they're at a disadvantage. That is a real problem. It is a serious issue. But it is not an adequate excuse for your company policies are getting people killed in traffic fatalities. It's hard to define exactly what fraud is. Generally, it involves something like a false statement of fact, and you either knew it was false, or you acted recklessly or negligently with regard to the truth, like you had no reason to believe it was true, but you didn't bother to check so you wouldn't find out it was false. That's not going to get you out of fraud. If you communicate that you know it's true, and you don't, then you're lying. Fraud also has to harm someone. People have to rely on the information. They have to be tricked by it. Or there isn't a legal case against you. It doesn't really matter. In the same way that, like, if you lie to your friend, that's bad, it's immoral, but it's not some sort of important legal issue. If there's no damages, then he doesn't get to sue you. But there are trickier cases. What if you imply some sort of fact without stating it? How clear does your implication have to be before it is your fault, rather than, oh, they shouldn't have read that into it, and it is their fault for assuming what you meant? And what about omissions, where you just don't mention something and people make assumptions? Sometimes those are reasonable assumptions. You can't mention every little detail, so people fill in the blanks in reasonable ways. But this creates some ambiguity about what fraud is, whether just not mentioning that as a way of, you can hide something by not mentioning it rather than directly, explicitly lying about it or making implications about it. And so when is that type of trickery fraud? What exactly should the standards be? You need a sophisticated, rational legal system to develop methods and procedures for judging these things and evaluating these cases. And our legal system currently is doing a mediocre job. So one of the things you would need to make capitalism really effective and have a better free market would be a more effective legal system that's better at creating reasonable precedents and following them, so that you get good predictability and understandability in advance of what would count as fraud or not. And so that it keeps up with the times. A lot of laws we have were written several decades ago and don't really understand computers and smartphones and other modern technologies. So there's so much sentiment from the pro-capitalist people, the libertarians, etc., about how do we get rid of the government, how do we shrink it. And it is true that the government does a lot of things it should not do, and there are problems with it. But also, the government fails to do a lot of things it should do. And part of what we should be thinking about is, how do we improve it? How do we make it better at evaluating fraud cases? How do we make it better at policing fraud? Libertarianism has a concept of minimum necessary force. The idea is that you use the minimum amount of force that will defend against some sort of threat. So if someone points a gun at you, you might shoot him, but you don't get to nuke him. Nuking him would be excessive. And the emphasis on this concept is less force. It tries to make it sound like a small amount of force. We're going to minimize force. However, what the concept really means is the minimum that will be effective for defense. So if the defense doesn't entirely work, then you use less than the minimum amount of force. So, for example, if you put someone in jail for 10 years and then you let them out, and then they commit another crime, You actually used too little force. You did not protect society. You failed at defense. You could have put them in jail for life, and then they would not have gotten out and committed another crime. So by using more force, you would have succeeded at defense. There are certainly reasons to let people out of jail, even when there's a risk that they will reoffend. And the reason is our uncertainty. We would like to let people out of jail, so it is worth some amount of risk. But if we knew for sure someone was going to reoffend, if we somehow had an oracle that could tell us that, then we shouldn't let people out. And some of them are not repentant. They don't claim to have reformed. They don't claim to have changed their mind. And some of them lie very, very transparently and don't plausibly claim to have changed their mind, reformed, etc. And we often let those people out, and there's a problem there. Part of the problem is that we're bad at reforming people, and our jails often just make people worse, not better, and are often run by prison gangs. And so it's not entirely the person's fault that they haven't reformed. Maybe if we gave them better access to books, and if they were safe during jail without having to join a prison gang for defense, and we gave them better access to various types of help and resources and so on, then more people would reform. That could be a form of defending society. It would lower people reoffending. So having better prisons is another thing that could help with a more capitalist, better minarchist society. It's a way of making the government better instead of just getting rid of it. Broadly, the libertarian view is that the government is super, super, super bad, and then nothing else is similar. Companies range from somewhat bad to somewhat good, or great, or whatever. And my current view is that more or less all of the large corporations are almost as bad as the government. They're on the same level as the government. They're not noticeably better. And this makes sense because they are large organizations just like the government, and they're made up of people in our society just like the government. And I think the libertarian counterargument is that the government has bad incentives, and the incentives make the people worse. And I think that the companies, first of all, have a bunch of bad incentives, but also that incentives don't change people in really deep, fundamental ways that much. And really, it's the same people in somewhat similar situations, and they act kind of the same. I don't think there's a huge difference between government and industry. The reason it's more or less all of the large corporations is that they all sort of revert to the mean, and they get standard CEOs who are all kind of the same type of person, usually. So there are some exceptions. When a company is newly founded and gets big really fast, then its founder may or may not have significant influence and control over it. But usually either the founder becomes reasonably normal and fits in as a CEO, or gets pushed out and someone else becomes the CEO. And then there are private companies that are, say, run by a family. And they have, when only a small number of people have control over something, you get more variance, more variation, more chance that they will be different in some way. And so for the same reason, small businesses, I don't think they're on average better, but some of them are better and some of them are worse. They have more variation. Whereas in a big company, it is hard for any individual to have a big impact. Even the CEO really has limited control over what happens with the company, because there are so many people involved and he can't micromanage what they all do. A CEO can often sink a company with a really bad decision, like a huge merger or something, or like canceling a product line or bringing out a new product line that makes no sense. But CEOs have, aside from some particular catastrophic decisions, they have limited power because there are all these other people that they have to work with and communicate with. The people in the company are not like robots who just implement the wishes of the CEO. It is hard for a CEO to get people to listen. They don't all just exactly follow orders however he intends. It's hard to give something like a complete, convincing case for what sort of fraud big companies are doing. There are a bunch of examples on my blog and my forum, and I think it is a suitable topic for debate. If someone disagrees and doesn't get the point and wants to argue the other side, you can have a discussion about it, rather than expecting me to preemptively just convince you without you giving any sorts of objections. Like, I can make a prima facie initial case by just pointing to several big examples of fraud, like the Wells Fargo account creation scandal. And you can just go look up major scandals in whatever industry you want, or major fraud cases. Just looking up the actual cases that go to the courts can give you some idea of some of the kinds of fraud that are going on. Another thing is, I think that fraud is a big deal, that a lot of people focus on physical violence and like street crime and people being punched and shot and stuff. And that's a big deal, but like white collar crimes are a big deal too. So for example, the founder of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes, is probably going to get off pretty lightly. And I don't think she should. She did, I think, over $1 billion of damage, and she did fraud. And I think that is, in a lot of ways, worse than shooting one person. It does more total harm to society. More damage done. I know it's hard to compare monetary damage to lives. And by the way, I think that Theranos literally killed people, so there were lives lost too. But even if it was only monetary damage due to fraud, I think over $1 billion of damage is worth more than a life, basically. It does more harm to the world, to civilization, to society, to have that much monetary damage than to have one person die. Now, I think you have to be careful how you use this concept. You don't want to say, oh, hey, they killed some people, but also they made a lot of money, which makes up for it, or something like that. Like, I don't think you should defend murderers or, like, manslaughterers or whatever. Like, they polluted that lake and indirectly killed some people, but they donated some money. Like, no, that's not okay. And in fact, that is one of the kinds of things that should be strongly policed under capitalism. Polluting a lake that you do not own is a property rights violation. In a reasonable capitalist system, people would have some rights over their drinking water and expect it to be clean, and if someone pollutes it, they are now that they are using force against those people who had the right to that water as clean drinking water. They're violating property rights and fairly directly harming people's bodies as well. Anyway, the point is, it's not to downplay how bad it is to murder someone, it is to upplay how bad it is to destroy huge amounts of money. People who manage to do over $10 million of harm should be viewed really, really negatively, a little bit like murderers. That is my view, is the amount of harm they're doing is so big that we should view them more negatively than we tend to. Theranos is such a blatant case. She knew she was lying. There's no controversy there. She lied on purpose. It was very blatant, intentional fraud. She was calculating. And she's still going to get off pretty easy. It says something about how poorly we police fraud. What I think should happen is basically she should get life in jail because she's done a lot worse than so many other criminals with very long sentences. And then I think her investors should be held accountable for funding her fraud. I think that if you invest millions of dollars that pays for fraud happening, then you should get in legal trouble. You should not be able to fund fraud and profit off it if it succeeds, and then wash your hands of it if it gets caught. And say, oh, I didn't know, don't blame me, I'm just an investor. If you invest a small amount of money, then you don't need to do much due diligence, and you can say you didn't know. But if you invest $10 million or more, you should definitely be doing a bunch of due diligence. And so it is possible that you do a good job at due diligence, and the person is just such a good liar and does so much fraud that they trick you, in which case you're an innocent victim. But I think Theranos investors did not do a reasonable job of due diligence and are therefore guilty. Another thing about fraud is a lot of companies just get fined by the government on a semi-regular basis, and they pay the fines, and they view it as a cost of doing business. And so what the government is doing is not effective enough a defense. They need to have much larger penalties to actually get the companies to change behavior. And there's something really wrong there. That is part of why I think fraud is rampant. These companies do things that are illegal. And many of them are things that would be illegal in a minarchist society. And then they pay a bit of money and then they keep doing it. And if the rule is you may not initiate force, you are absolutely prohibited from initiating force, then enforcement actions need to be escalated until these companies actually stop. Anyway, if you disagree, you can discuss it on the forum, you can ask questions, and you can also invoke my debate policy.